Hey, you guys, gals, and bums, and welcome back to A Few Bad Men. All right. In the 1920s and 30s, Boston's Charles King Solomon was as big as they come. He was the biggest fence in the city. He dealt in millions of dollars of booze. He ran brothels, operated gambling houses, and from 1928 to 1933, no one brought in more dope from Holland and Belgium than the King. His network stretched from Massachusetts to New Jersey, and he was part of what the newspapers called the Big Six, the six biggest Jewish gangsters in the country. But to the public, he was a sportsman and a club owner who mingled with Boston's upper class. He clawed his way up from the Salem docks to become one of Boston's most powerful men. But in the end, his reign would be cut short by some two-bit punks acting on impulse. The early years of Charles Solomon's life are hazy. He was born in either 1894 or 96, in the Russian Empire or in Syria. His parents moved to the States sometime after he was born, and the family settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan or Boston's South Side. But by the 1910s, they were definitely in Boston. As a youth, he had a job working behind the counter at a luncheonette near the docks. But by his 20s, Charles was making his money in the streets. On November 2nd, 1910, Charles turned himself into the police and was arraigned in a Chelsea court. He was charged with receiving stolen goods after the police found stolen clothes and furs in his home in Revere. This was the second time he had been charged with stealing furs, clothes, and other property from the offices of the Adams Express Company. Frederick A. Gallagher, a teamster, was also arrested for the thefts that valued at $592. The charges were dismissed when the state star witness, a 16-year-old boy, was found to be a fraud. By 1912, Charles was involved in any criminal activity he could be, except for violence. He preferred to use his brain instead of his brawn to make his way. He was quickly becoming the go-to guy for fencing stolen goods. He also knew a lot of criminals, so he became a bail bondsman. He was tall, good-looking, a great dancer, and had a way with the ladies. And a few of them were willing to do some immoral things with other men for money and turn it over to him. And it was around this time he started dealing morphine and cocaine, both of which were still legal in the United States. In 1914, the government made those things illegal, along with heroin. Charles used his connections to corner the market on all three in Boston. By 1914, Charles was already a high roller. He was wearing expensive suits and had several diamond rings and stick pins. On the night of June 14, 1914, Charles was on the West End, and he was lured into a house on Stamford Street to participate in a card game. When he entered the house, he saw several men seated at a table playing, but instead of being given a seat, he was taken into a dark room where he was grabbed by two men. They slashed him in the face, left shoulder, and left forearm with a razor, and robbed him of $100 cash and a $300 stick pin. A car then pulled up front, and the two assailants, along with the three men playing cards, hopped in and took off. Charles was taken to the hospital where he was treated and released. Over the next few years, Charles became known as the King. He had his hand in every pie and made a lot of money. He spent some of that money on property, and at least one of those properties he used as a house of ill repute. In January of 1918, one of his men, John Larson, was arrested for keeping a disorderly house within a 5-mile radius of a military base. Charles paid his bail. 2 days later, he and Joseph Rosen were arrested on charges of having sworn false statements while furnishing the bond. Charles was held on $500 bail, but his charges would eventually be dropped. He probably used his own bail bond. By now, he had become a regular face in the courthouse. He was teamed up with some crooked lawyers to make sure that their clients got out quickly. Later that year, he was brought in and charged with being idle and disorderly. In the court, he flashed a roll of 10 grand to show the judge that he was not idle or disorderly. The police said that he had been seen in the presence of lawbreakers, pickpockets, and disorderly women. Solomon's lawyer argued that as a bail bondsman, it was his job to be seen with lawbreakers, pickpockets, and disorderly women who needed bailing out. He was convicted and sentenced to 6 months. He was released pending appeal. While out on bail, he was arrested again for speeding. He paid the fine and was released. The next day, he was found not guilty for being idle and disorderly. In January of 1919, he was arrested again for receiving stolen goods. The Robert W. Hull Company was broken into, and $3,500 worth of merchandise was stolen, and some of that was found in Charles's home. The case had been pushed back for years. Charles argued that he didn't know the stuff was stolen, but the jury saw through it, and he was sentenced to 3 to 5 years in state prison. He was only away for a few months before he got a retrial. This time, his lawyers were more successful, and he was found not guilty. On July 12, 1920, he was indicted on 2 counts. One was another accessory after the fact. Charles got $9,000 worth of leather goods from John Cameron. The only problem was Cameron had stolen the stuff. He was also charged with conspiring to steal $24,000 worth of leather goods from the shop of Israel Hamburger. He pled not guilty to both, and both cases would eventually be dismissed. November 16, 1921, he was arrested by federal agents along with Bert Chapman, a postal robber, and charged with receiving stolen Liberty bonds. Again, the case would be dropped, and he was a free man. Although prohibition had been the law of the land since 1920, Charles did not join the rank of bootleggers right away. He was still focused on his other moneymakers: fencing stolen goods, bail bondsmen, prostitution, and dope. In 1922, he rented a room from a Mrs. Schaefer under the name Myers at 7 Walnut Park Road, Roxbury. A few months later, Solomon's man, Tony Farino, was arrested at the address after a police investigation. They found him in possession of narcotics and charged him with violating federal narcotics laws. He was found not guilty, but Mrs. Rose Schaefer was found guilty of perjury and arrested on $10,000 bond. She initially told prosecutors that it was Solomon who rented the room, but told a different story on the stand. A few days later, Charles and Farino were charged with conspiracy to intimidate. You see, the night before she took the stand, Solomon sent some of his men to see her. They told her to say you ain't sure it was him, and gave her $300. Charles was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years hard labor in Atlanta, but he was out in 13 months. In March of 1924, he was arrested for conspiracy to rob a U.S. mail truck of $1.5 million in Los Angeles in April of 1923. He was charged with fencing $300,000 of the stolen securities. On the stand, he said, "I've never been to Los Angeles in my life." His charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. It was around this time that Charles Solomon got into bootlegging. But he was not toting a Tommy on the running board of a truck. He was the financier. He oversaw the operation and made sure everything ran smooth. He set up contacts in Europe, Canada, and the Caribbean. He bought ships, speedboats, and warehouses. He paid off the right Coast Guards, which allowed him to bring his booze in straight off the Atlantic. Charles started rubbing shoulders with some other heavyweights in the Jewish underworld. Louis Lepke Buchalter, Meyer Lansky, Dutch Schultz, Longy Zwillman, Ben Siegel, and King Solomon made up the Big Six, or so the papers said. He represented Boston at the Atlantic City Conference in 1929, hosted by Atlantic City boss Nucky Johnson. And he could be seen now as much on Broadway as in Boston. King Solomon was at the peak of his career. The press labeled him the Al Capone of the East Coast, but unlike Al, King Solomon was never accused of murder. He had some friends in Brownsville who enjoyed hurting people and would have no problem hopping on a train carrying only a bag with an ice pick, a length of rope, and a fresh shirt to straighten out any problems he had. Charles had gotten married twice by now, and his second marriage to Bertha Solomon was on the fritz. He was often seen in public with his girlfriend, Dorothy England. Dorothy was a beautician who ran the salon that Charles bought for her. King Solomon was now the biggest crook in Boston. By 1930, he owned several businesses, amusement companies, a gas company, a loan company, restaurants, and hotels. And in 1931, he bought the Coconut Grove, a glamorous nightclub at 1 Piedmont Street. The club was originally opened back in 1927 by entertainer Mickey Albert and musician Jacques Renard. Charles bought the place for 10 grand, but he knew he could not be the owner on paper. He needed a front man. Angelo Lippi was the maitre d' when the Coconut Grove opened back in 1927, but he had gotten a better job at the Hotel Touraine. Charles approached Lippi at the Touraine and asked him to come back and take charge of the Coconut Grove. Lippi told him that he was doing well at the hotel. "How much you making here?" Charles asked. $100 a week, said Lippi. "Done. You're hired for $100 a week." Lippi signed his name, and on paper, he was the owner. But in reality, he was just there to sign blank checks. Charles also hired Rose Ponzi, the wife of Charles Ponzi, the inventor of the Ponzi scheme, who was in jail at the time, to be the bookkeeper. Rose would give Lippi a stack of checks to sign, checks for entertainment, food, etc. After his first week, when Lippi went to get paid, he was only given $85. The next week, it was $75. The next week, it was $60. After a couple months, it was $35. He went to Charles with his concerns, but Charles was too busy being King Solomon. He was the host of the hottest nightclub in Boston, and all the high rollers loved him. He would dress in a tuxedo or a white sports coat and mingle with the people who wouldn't have spit on him 15 years ago. He became friends with some of the biggest entertainers in the time. Legendary hostess Texas Guinan loved him, and she called him Old Rubber Lips. Charles loved being the respected man among polite society. "I can't give it up. It means everything to me," he said. "I've had enough of the hard times and the rotten and the miserable. I was always a bum to nice people. Now when I put on these evening clothes and step through the doors of the Coconut Grove, I'm a gentleman. I'm not a heel, you understand? I'm their host. Over the next few years, Charles lived the life he dreamed about when he was a kid. He had money, power, respect, the finest cars and clothes, and the prettiest women on his arm. His booze operation was grossing $1.5 million a week, or so the feds say. And his drug network stretched up and down the East Coast. But you know what they say about all good things. Prohibition was months away from being repealed, and financially, he was set. But he was looking to make one last shipment before the party ended. On January 3rd, Charles Solomon was indicted by the federal government for being the leader of a large rum-running operation that used radios to coordinate large shipments of booze along the coast. He was released on bond, left New York, and went back to Boston. If Charles was worried, he didn't show it. He told reporters that this was all just a mistake, and he would have no problem proving his innocence. He was scheduled to appear back in New York on January 25th. The evening of the 23rd, he decided he needed a night out on the town before heading back to testify. He showed up at the Coconut Grove with 2 young showgirls, Claire White and Helen Etheridge, on his arm. They drank, ate, danced, and laughed until 3:30 a.m. when the club closed. Not ready to head home just yet, Charles and his lady friends made their way to the Cotton Club. Not the Cotton Club in Harlem, but one in Boston. It too was in a black neighborhood, hired black entertainers, and catered to people with money, and Charles was part owner. But as fate would have it, 6 men were in a car headed to the Cotton Club too. Their last stop on a night full of bar hopping. They got to the club minutes before Charles. The place was packed when Charles arrived, and he and his party were seated at a table. Across the room from him sat the 6 men. They had their eyes on Charles, who was dressed to the nines and was wearing a $2,000 diamond ring. Charles pulled out his bankroll and asked the waitress to break 100 for him. An off-duty police officer forgot his wallet and could not pay his tab and asked Charles to vouch for him, and he did. A few minutes later, he got up and went to the bathroom. At the same time, 4 of the 6 men seated across from him did too. James Skeets Coyne, Frank Carlonis, John O'Donnell, and James Burke walked in behind the King of Boston. Burke stood outside while the other 3 went in. James Coyne pulled his gun and stuck it into Charles' ribs and demanded all of his money. He gave up his bankroll, $4,600, but when they tried pulling his ring off, it was stuck, and Charles protested. "You've already got my roll. What else do you want?" James Coyne, drunk out of his mind, replied, "You've got this coming to you. You've had this coming to you." And then shots rang out. Coyne fired 4 times at the King of Boston. 1 hit his neck, 1 grazed his shoulder, 1 went through his chest, and 1 got lodged in his abdomen. The 4 men then ran out of the bathroom, down the steps, pushed the coke girl aside, grabbed their coats, and hopped into their car. They were joined by the others, and they took off south. Back in the club, patrons heard the commotion and saw Charles stagger out of the bathroom, holding his neck and stomach. He collapsed and said, "I've been shot. Please call a doctor and get me outside to some air." He was taken to the hospital. On the way, he told his friend, "The rats got me." By the time he got to the hospital, it was too late. When police asked him who shot him, he gave a faint smile and closed his eyes. They would never open again. When the car full of shooters left, they were headed towards the south end and decided to turn around and go the other way. When they made it to the west end, they were pulled over by a police officer for going the wrong way down a one-way street. The cop, unaware of the shooting, felt this was an honest mistake, and he let them go. They dropped one of the men off, and the rest headed to Florida. After hearing they were wanted for the shooting, they returned to Boston and turned themselves in. James Skeets Coyne will be found guilty of the shooting. O'Donnell, Carlonis, and Burke were found guilty of robbery. Coyne would be in jail until the middle of World War II, when prisoners like him were used to help in the war effort. He was killed on a dock when a piece of heavy machinery fell on him in 1943. Thousands of people turned out to see Boston's king laid to rest, including many politicians, entertainers, and gangsters. Despite making millions of dollars in his life, Charles's wife was left with only $400 in the bank account and thousands of dollars worth of debt. She would get remarried to a dentist only months after his death. And that, my friends, is the skinny on Charles King Solomon. I hope you guys enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed telling it. I hope you learned some things about King Solomon that you didn't know. If you didn't know about King Solomon, I'm glad I can introduce you to a new gangster. All right, so if you like what we do over here at A Few Bad Men and you want to join the gang, first thing you got to do is you got to bump off that subscribe button. All right. Second thing you got to do is you got to break that thumb and you got to ring that bell, set it for all notifications. If you want to slide an envelope upstairs to the boss to help the channel run smooth, the PayPal link is in the description. Head over to the merch store, get yourself something nice, get your girl something nice, get your guy something nice. All right, So this has been A Few Bad Men. Keep your nose clean and don't take any wooden nickels. I see yous in the funnies.